to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway. And good evening, Caw Nation. Jonelle was not going to be with us tonight as she is feeling a little under the weather. I'm Brian Grimes, and I'm going to be the producer of this little episode here with Dr. Kline and Dr. Kline's special guest, Dr. Josh Bloom. Go ahead and take it away, Dr. Kline.
Good evening. A lot of people always tell me when I start lecturing away on history that history is not important. But in the business of the disappearance of opiates from the United States, it is important. Not only have 75% of doctors given up prescribing, surveys on our Twitter show that only 20% now, 1 in 5, are receiving appropriate treatment. And what's happened over the last 6 months, at least with my patients, is now the pharmacies are refusing to fill prescriptions. It's not going to be long. There's going to be no opiates in this country. We have the hugest, most devastating healthcare crisis in the history of the country, and nobody knows it. So we need to understand the mechanisms of the fear about overprescribing. That's what's behind most everything. Overprescribing. Because what happens when you overprescribe is that you create dopings and addicts. The problem is that's really not true. There's only a certain number of people that can become addicted. You have to have a genetic variance in order to become opiate addicted. You can become addicted to cocaine and methamphetamine, but not everybody can become addicted to opiates. So how did this get started? What was it about opiates? Opiate users have the lowest crime rate of all the other addiction substances. Lower than alcohol, lower than amphetamines, lower than cocaine. But yet we're focused on that. How much of the press talks about cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol? Almost nothing. So what is it about opium? Well, it started with the Spanish-American War, believe it or not, when we took over the Philippines in the latter part of the 19th century, around 1895. And an Episcopal minister was dispatched there to set up a church and convert all the Philippines to Christianity. And he was successful. His name was Brent, Reverend Brent. The problem was that the Chinese there, who like to smoke opium, like other people like to drink alcohol, did not want to become Christians, and this pissed him off. So he began a campaign along with the great yellow journalist Randolph Hearst of starting to cast aspersions upon the Chinese people as a whole. When the Chinese came to the United States, they set up opium dens, which they had done in the Philippines. And people would go there and basically get drunk, and get basically sleepy. It was less powerful than getting drunk because you didn't lose your inhibitions, you just got sleepy. Narcotic means a drug to cause sleep. So people that take opium products generally nod off and get sleepy. So what was it? Why was there a problem with people getting sleepy in these opium dens? Randolph Hearst, who was a severe xenophobic and did not like people from Asia, began spreading stories in his newspaper that white women were found in these Chinese opium dens losing their inhibitions and running off with the Chinese opium den owners. Problem was, no good Chinese man would run off with some white woman in the first place. And secondly, opium did not really reduce your inhibitions. Alcohol did, the other drugs did, but Randolph Hearst crafted this myth. He crafted it so well that a doctor joined Reverend Brent, a doctor by the name of Hamilton Wright, in 1908, was appointed to be the nation's first opium commissioner. Wright warned, narcotics have become the greatest drug, Americans have become the greatest drug fiends in the world. Anguished veterans were hooked on morphine. Genteel society ladies dosed up with laudanum, a tincture of opium. The wonder drug was widely used as a cough suppressant. Opiates were wickedly addictive. The habit has this nation in its grip to an astonishing extent, said Dr. Wright. Our prisons and hospitals are full of victims. It has robbed 10,000 businessmen of moral sense and made them beasts who prey on their fellows. It has become the most fertile cause of unhappiness and sin. Back to the sex. So this was 1908 that he went on his crusade, and guess what happened in 1909? The first restrictive act was passed called the Opium Exclusion Act of 1909. In 1909, Congress passed a law that would outlaw opium in the form that could be used in opium dens. Pointed obviously at the Chinese. Smoking opium had attracted notice from temperance advocates, missionaries, and moral reformers. So the thing started out as a moral reform. This law was not passed for medical reasons. It was passed as an anti-Chinese law because the Chinese were running away with white women. Otherwise, they didn't care what Chinese did. But the concern was that white women, remember this was the end of the Victorian era, were being seduced, creating a new class of criminals. The Exclusion Act really started the opiate epidemic because it increased the price of opiates that you could buy on the counter. At that time, if you bought an opiate on the counter, it was inexpensive. You could use it for whatever you wanted, and there was no crime. So when did the crime start? It started when the price of opium shot up with the Exclusion Act, and now we had illegal drug consumers, a new class of criminals. So for the first time, people that took opiates were criminals. Just opiates, though, not cocaine. So the government started out and started the great epidemic of crime. Illegal heroin, illegal whatever could be purchased on the street. The prices went shot through the roof, and they started to write articles about the death of the Chinese because they weren't going to get their drugs anymore. The Harrison Act followed 5 years later, which was even more restrictive, tried to now tax opiates because of the evil immorality. Problem is, when the price goes up, then what happens? Right, more criminal traffickers. So now the traffickers really took hold. In a paper written in 1916, 2 years after the Harrison Act, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, it started to point out that this really was the first heroin epidemic because guess what? The heroin was cheaper. How many people have heard about that recently? People go to heroin because it's cheaper. The back to the sex, they thought that heroin was better because it prolonged the sexual act. And this is an article written in 1916 when they never even talked about sex. So the illegal, what would happen is the crooks would go out and buy large quantities of heroin and then resell it on the streets. Does that sound familiar? So in 1910 to 1916, this is when the heroin epidemic started. And it started because the United States government felt it could control morals. And Josh, if you want to interrupt me and just, grunt or something.
I usually try to do a little better than that.
Go right ahead.
Some interesting factoids that the listeners may not know. Heroin was, I'll back up a second. Both aspirin and heroin were invented in the 1890s. And we use the same two classes of drugs today with very little difference. So aspirin is now Advil, and heroin's now whatever. If that shows anything, what we've got 130 years of research into a better painkiller, and there's nothing there. That shows how hard it is. That something's either going to just destroy your stomach, or maybe addict you, or get you thrown in jail, and there's nothing better. Coming from the world of drug discovery for 25 years, that's even harder than regular drug discovery, because it's nearly impossible to get anything. It's the toughest job in the world. But I pity the people that were working or have been working on non-opioid painkillers, because they've got nothing. And some problems, people always say, well, why don't we have a cure for Alzheimer's, and why don't we have a cure for cancer? And the answer is, it's difficult. It's not because people are not trying. Some things you just can't beat. So anyhow, another interesting fact is that heroin was, and talk about getting it wrong, heroin was invented because it was supposed to be less addictive than morphine. Everybody was taking morphine, walking around addicted, stoned, or however you want to put it. And of course, now we know that heroin is a prodrug of morphine and delivers a much more powerful punch much more quickly. So that's one of the first ironies that we'll be talking about tonight. And Tom, you've been quiet for too long. I'm getting worried. So you should talk a little.
You should be worried. Because I'm going to go on for another 2 hours. This is a very nice article I'm reading from, by the way. I should give the author credit. It was published in counterpunch.org. It's an excellent, called the Opium Exclusion Act of 1909. And the fellow's name is Geringer, Gieringer, Dale Geringer. And his little synopsis is very good. Really pulls it together, because the next thing that happened back in the 1920s was they started to report that dope fiends were responsible for all the crime, that all crime was linked to drug fiends. They never really specify which drug. And talking to some addict friends that I have, addicts really are too drowsy to do much in the way of crime. They do a lot of stealing, shoplifting, and robbing stuff from their families. But the articles written about drug fiends started to mix opiates now with the other drugs. The famous movie in 1930 about the drug fiends was, what was the name of it again? So it started to become that narcotics were any other drug as well. Marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, but not alcohol. We did try to prohibit alcohol about the same time that we were prohibiting these drugs. So why did we do all this? Fear of addiction, phobia. The same thing we have today. So now, making dope fiends criminals, now the drug prohibition and law enforcement took over in the 1920s. 1925, law enforcement outlawed the medical use of diamorphine, which is Bayer's heroin. It's a great drug, and we've not been able to use it because we got this big drug prohibition industry going. In 1912, according to the article, we started having these international conferences about how we're supposed to limit the importing and exporting of drugs, many of them not specified. Sometimes the list got into the 20s and 30s. International drug control, unprecedented prohibition-related drug crime, corruption, and violence in the world, says the author. So then it moved into the 60s and 70s when we switched around from having misdemeanors for drug possession. Now it became felonies. And you kind of know the rest of the story. Millions of people arrested. The most common drug that's involved with arrests is cocaine, because cocaine was assigned to the black folks in the South. At one point, the feds started to publish articles, and now we're into Henry Anslinger, started to publish articles that Negroes, as they called them, who were using cocaine, made their skin thicker. So all the sheriff's departments down in the South increased the size of the load in their bullets, which means they made the bullets more powerful to penetrate the skin. So it started off with sex and miscegenation, the great fear of the white folks having their race become impure. Purity seems to be a word that started off with Puritans, and it seems to be flowing through a lot of this, and even today, that even though we have forgotten our history, there's something about opioids that's different than alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine. It's different because it's immoral, because it can possess you. And it possesses you in a way that's unpredictable. You see, the problem with witches was you didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know what a witch could do to you. Very frightening. Same thing with opiates. People are running around saying you're overprescribing, you're overprescribing, you're overprescribing. That sounds like a very fearful voice. If you're overprescribing, you're putting stuff out in the street, everybody's going to get addicted, and you're going to kill us or do something we can't predict. And it's not true. The danger lies with alcohol. I asked my friend, the heroin addict, I said, do you guys really engage in crime? And he said, no. He says, we're really not. But I said, well, who's the worst? He said, alcoholics, without thinking. Alcohol produces more crime than opiates ever will. The deaths from alcohol-related drugs are 5 times that of the deaths from opiates. So then we got to go into the next phase. Now we're talking about deaths for the first time. And we're trying to cleverly use the word death to equal addiction. That's not true. They're 2 different things. We are not creating more addicts running around overprescribing. What we're doing is we are creating more deaths in the addiction community. by controlling drugs. And I think Dr. Bloom published an article about the impact of the federal government trying to control prescription drugs and its impact on death in the heroin community. Josh, take it away.
Well,
Josh, wake up.
It was a coma. I wasn't asleep. You're a doctor. You should know the difference, Tom. The mess that we're going through today is an interesting mix of government bumbling and free market capitalism. And one depends on the other. So let's go back to 1995 or so, when OxyContin became approved, and it actually wasn't a bad idea. I mean, I know that Purdue's taking a lot of heat, just all of it deserved, as far as I can tell, for pushing OxyContin as something that was much safer, or contribute to addiction. But the science behind the first OxyContin was not bad, because if you took the pill and it was made to be time released, in general, for things like antidepressants, painkillers, time release is better pharmacologically, because instead of what we call a sawtooth pattern, where you get up and down every 4 hours when you take the pill, and the blood levels go down and they go back up, you get a gradual rise and then a very slow falling off. So extended release makes sense scientifically. But what they didn't count on was to make an extended release pill, one of the things you have to do is you have to encapsulate tiny amounts of the drug, and these little, let's just call them tiny little solid bubbles, they open up at different times in your digestive system. So that's the essence behind slow release. It's not strictly correct, but it's good enough. So if you take the pill and you use a mortar and pestle and you grind it up, it breaks these little bubbles open, and all of a sudden you got between 20 and 160 milligrams of pure oxycodone. And once people figured out they could do that, there was a ton of the stuff available, because Purdue was, they were doing some awful things in terms of pushing the drug, and some of them are going to jail, and some more of them are going to jail, and there's a special place in hell for whoever was behind this. But the science behind it was actually okay. But then the science behind it got even better, and the problem got worse. So let's say 95 through 2009, there was a very steady growth in sales and prescriptions of OxyContin. Some of it, most of it, I don't even know, was diverted or stolen. And there was, especially in the Midwest, there was a ton of drugs sitting around. People were using them. So some got addicted. And the death rate from all opioids kind of wandered up steadily from the mid-90s to 2009 or 10. So then Purdue scientists figured out something that they've been trying to do for a while, and that's to make OxyContin abuse-proof. And they did very clever formulation. And if you tried to grind up the pill, it turned into like a big mushy thing, and you couldn't smoke it, you couldn't snort it. All of a sudden, the recreational use of OxyContin fell off a cliff. It was almost immediate. At the exact same time, we saw heroin deaths shoot up. And it isn't subtle. Perhaps if anybody wants, I can send you to our website and you can see what these graphs look like. Or it's also, I've tweeted them out. But there are occurrences that happen by association, which does not necessarily mean cause and effect, but some of them do: tobacco, smoke, and cancer. And the approval of abuse-resistant OxyContin started the real deaths, and that's when everything kind of started going downhill and people started dying, and that's when they started paying attention. So what happened then was heroin use shot up. I don't have a graph in front of me. It was, let's take a look here. Yeah, about 2,000 people died from heroin in 2010, and it was about up to 14 or so thousand by 2014 or 15. So if you look at the shape of the curve, it's kind of wandering slowly up, and there's this inflection point right at 2010. So there's absolutely no question in my mind that this is the free market capitalism part. You can't use the old OxyContin. And what was left, the price went nuts. But so people tried Vicodin, Percocet, not as good because it's got a very dangerous drug called Tylenol in it. So you snort too much of that, you'll die from the Tylenol. And then heroin got cheaper. So the more pills got restricted, or the fewer were available for people to use, even if they were addicted. Heroin went in the exact opposite direction. So the final chapter in this mess is now we've got all these restrictions on pills and all these terrible suffering that's going on from the pain patients, and that's resulting in more people having to go to heroin. But then even a little more free market economy coming from Asia. 2014, and I've talked to the FDA about, the DEA about this, and that's when fentanyl started coming in to the country to fill the heroin market. So now you've got fentanyl, which is, depending on which derivative you're talking about, is thousands of times more potent than heroin. So now you can carry a little package in your pocket. So it was supply and demand, and the government made it far worse by these crazy restrictions, to the point where now pain patients have to go out onto the street with fentanyl test kits to see if the heroin they're buying is clean. And if you can think of a worse example of public policy than that, write me and let me know, because that's about as bad as it gets. That's bonfire of the vanities right there. So, without dwelling too much more on this, I absolutely firmly believe that if you took buckets of opioids and threw them out onto the street in every city, the death rate will go down, and quickly. That's probably not going to appear in the New York Times or any other place, but the pills aren't what are killing people. Tom, you know that. All the other doctors I've spoken to know this. The CDC statistics, if you look carefully at them, they try and dress it up, but it's not the pills. It's the heroin and now the fentanyl. That's very dangerous. So by restricting the pills, it's like, I was interviewed once on the George Knapp show, Coast to Coast Radio, and he said, going after the pills is like if Korea attacks us, we attack Cuba. It makes just about as much sense. So there's 5 minutes to the history of this disaster, and it's a combination of stupidity, actually technical brilliance, and money. There's a bad novel with a bad outcome.
Dr. Kline, we've got a couple callers. Would you like to take them?
I think I killed Tom. Tom's dead. Oh, no.
Hello, Dr. Kline.
Oops, I had the old mute button on.
There
Oh,
you
God.
go. Would you like to take a couple calls?
Yes,
All
let's
right.
do that.
Caller from area code 209. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline?
And
Hi,
Joshua.
this is Ariane out in California.
Mm-hmm.
And I posted about a week and a half ago on Twitter, we talk about this OD correlation causation issue with increased prescribing. But if we look at our social situation, just around the time when OxyContin in the late 90s was being manufactured and put on the market, doctors were being mandated to treat pain more aggressively.
Yep.
And in 2001, we had a terrorist attack in this country that left everyone in this nation reeling psychologically.
Yep.
And not too long after that, we have a financial disaster hit us as well. Mm-hmm. So now we're going off to war, a bunch of our young men and women and fathers and mothers and sons and sisters and daughters, and people are losing their retirement money because of the banking debacle. They're losing their homes. They're losing their jobs. We basically were hit by a collective psychic trauma in this nation. And what's interesting is that middle-class America, which is, we could say maybe affects more white America, was hit pretty hard by the economic recession. Now, when we understand that addiction isn't about really the substance per se, it's more complex than that. It has to do with a bunch of biopsychosocial factors, and putting the blame on what's called overprescribing, which I think is a BS term in and of itself. If we look deeply into what's going on, at the same time that prescribing is being mandated to go up to treat pain adequately because we were under-treating pain, one could actually make a stronger case that all those other things that were going on in society were actually probably more a contributing factor to the rise in addiction issues overall.
Actually, I've been kind of wondering about all this. So I've been carefully doing research and looking up numbers and government reports and blah, blah. And actually, the addiction rate has not gone up. And it's not gone up since 1925. The addiction rate today, by government statistics, is 1 million heroin addicts. And if you divide that by the population, you get less than 0.5%. So if 1925, you take 200,000 heroin addicts and divide it by the population, then you get the exact same figure. So the question is, with all this overprescribing, what is actually happening? Are we creating more addicts? Government figures don't show it. But Josh and you kind of pointed out that trying to control the pills is now correlated with increased death rate. So why is that? Well, if you talk to addicts on the street, addicts, heroin addicts, or what we call type 2 mu receptor addicts, need to have a certain amount of opiates once addicted, whether we like it or not. It's like people that drink too much water. There are pathologic water drinkers. It usually comes from the pituitary, and they just gulp down gallons of water every day, but you can't stop them because they can't stop. That's the nature of the disease. It's a rare disease. It does not occur frequently. Other forms of addiction like cocaine and marijuana, methamphetamines, those are much more common than opiate addiction. So we're running around talking about the pills when in fact we should be talking about a disease. The government has never liked talking about the disease. They made some concessions for people with type 2 opiate addiction in the methadone clinics. And I went by one the other day here in Raleigh, and there they were, all lined up out inside in front of the methadone clinic where everybody could gawk at them, because the federal government makes people come and pay $10 to pick up their their methadone tablet every single morning for 3 months. And during that time, they pay $10 each, $300 a day, $3,000 a day for a clinic that just hands out methadone. And did you know that the DEA, the federal police, get a cut for monitoring these clinics? We're so afraid of addiction phobia that the police are involved with these clinics. So every time you read an article about the effectiveness of methadone and or Suboxone, oh, the death rate drops, the crime rate drops. Why don't we embrace that? Why don't we treat this as a real disease? Because the brain researchers will tell you this is a real disease that you can see on PET scans, just like we recently saw for fibromyalgia. So there's science to this. There's science to opiate addiction. And you are correct. It's got nothing to do with prescriptions. And that was a very, very unscientific correlation. Increased deaths, increased prescriptions, therefore increased prescriptions cause the deaths. That's the famous example used in logic. The rooster crows in the morning before the sun rises, therefore the rooster causes the sun to rise. Now, the scientist, yes?
You have to qualify that a little bit.
Oh, God.
I would say, I'm sorry,
Yes.
but I'm a qualifier, and I qualify
All right,
to be
go
a
ahead.
qualifier. I would say legal prescriptions and addiction have very little to do with each other. But let's not discount the impact of the pill mills, because those guys, and they should rot in hell, who were selling thousands and thousands of OxyContin or writing phony prescriptions so people could get them, that did cause addiction. So I think you need to make the distinction between legal and illegal prescriptions.
Well,
Aside from that, I completely
yeah.
agree with you.
Josh, we have to argue here. Can we just, like, you put on your little boxing gloves and I'll put on mine? How do you know it caused addiction? Maybe it just supplied the addiction. There were a lot of folks in West Virginia that were being given prescriptions by their doctors because they were of the 0.5% people who become addicted, and they had a bona fide type 2 opiate addiction. So by flooding in more prescription drugs, people who were addicted could take the prescription drugs, which is a lot safer for them. Here comes the heresy. It was a lot safer for them than getting their hands on heroin and fentanyl. So the question is, were more people triggered in their addiction? Do they cause the addiction? And I have seen no data that proves that. But feel free to respond, my friend.
Well, it's the kind of thing we could probably talk about for a long time. But the chronology of this problem, if you really look at the timeline and the graphs, it strongly supports the story that I have been sticking to. And it's probably a mix of both, what we both believe. Having so much OxyContin available certainly impacted the people who were already addicted or were prone to addiction genetically. But it's clear that deaths rose after OxyContin was introduced, and at a much more rapid rate than any kind of pill deaths, anything we'd seen in the past. So, yeah, is that proof? No. it's common sense, but I cannot prove it.
That's okay. I will yield for 5 minutes.
Would you like to go ahead and take this other call, Dr. Kline?
Sure.
Okay. Caller from area code 313. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline?
Hi, good evening. My name is Andrew, and my question is about someone named Nan Golden and her organization. She's in New York. She's been holding protests at the Met and at the other big museum there. What's that? Guggenheim? Is that the one with the
Guggenheim
no.
walkway?
Well, yeah, there was a protest at the Guggenheim yesterday, the day before.
Guggenheim, yes.
When they were throwing papers to mimic OxyContin prescriptions. Yeah.
Oh, because of the
People
Sackler family.
Sacklers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in Purdue.
Yeah. Well, we can just hang. We can hang anybody, for this epidemic. Go ahead.
Yeah, is there any validity to holding the Sacklers responsible for this? I mean, they started Purdue Farm.
Well, should we be holding distillers in Kentucky and Tennessee responsible for drunken drivers?
It's a little different.
It gets way down the chain. It's how far down the chain you go. So we can blame the pill, and then we can blame the drug company, and then we can blame the owners of the drug company, and then pretty soon we can blame the mothers of the owners of the drug company. So I don't know. I think that if people make accusations, they should be able to stand up and give a reason. Okay? If the Sacklers are responsible, where are they responsible? And what does their donating to the Guggenheim Museum have to do with it? So you see a lot of this during these epidemics of fear. We have an epidemic of fear. Fear. That's what the epidemic was during the communist era. Fear, the communists. During the crack cocaine epidemic, fear of the black criminals. Fear in the 1690s of becoming possessed by the devil. Fear. We need to deal with the fear of addiction, phobia. I had a patient the other day who was phobic about medical issues, and I said, how do you deal with this? He says, getting facts helps. So in other words, he was afraid a lot of medical procedures and stuff he didn't really have a lot of information on. He felt better when he got information. So part of what we do on this show is try to present facts. Now, they may sound funny, but it's worth listening to. If there's 1 million addicts in the United States divided by the population, that comes up to less than 1%. What's going on? We have to answer these questions first before we run around arresting doctors. By the way, doctors first got arrested in 1915 when the federal drug police felt that treating an addict was not in the course of their professional practice. Fear. Fear drives, in this country, fear really does drive a lot of serious epidemics. There were a lot of people hurt by the McCarthy era. I didn't realize how long it went on, but I was reading about one screenwriter from Hollywood. He was blackballed for 14 years. People were locked up during the McCarthy era for having neighbors that they went and talked to at a barbecue who were suspected communists. And we've got the same thing now. We got people running around throwing tissue paper at museums because we're so afraid of being possessed. Now, so here's a little fact. If you take your very first opiate, your very first Vicodin, your very first oxycodone, you got two things are going to happen to you. One, you're going to have pain relief and you're going to feel relaxed. And for less than 1% of the population with a bad addiction gene, you're going to go to the moon. It's the most wonderful feeling imaginable. You talk to addicts. So wait a minute, there's something very simple. All doctors and patients should be aware of the fact that addiction is triggered with the very first pill. And I'm going to present data later on after I talk to more addicts. But the ones I've talked to, about 20 so far, every single addict I talked to said the same thing, and I was surprised. It happened on the first pill. So what's that tell you? It tells you that you have a side effect of opiates that occurs about 0.5%, just like serious side effects occur with a lot of drugs, like dying or developing cancer. So if you view it as a disease, nobody wants to become addicted, but then nobody wants to die from their arthritis drug either or develop cancer. So this is a serious side effect, but at least it's treatable. I mean, if you die from your arthritis drug, it's not treatable. It just wipes your bone marrow out. So what would happen if you are 32 years old, as this happened to a doctor, never drank, never had any opiates, takes his first Vicodin, and all of a sudden he goes to the moon? Well, the next thing you should do is sign in with his doctor, who, of course, has taken a course in opiates and understands how this all works. And he says, okay, you've got a side effect. You got this bad side effect. It's called addiction, and you're going to feel wonderful every time you take these Vicodin. So you're going to feel so wonderful, you're going to start to intensely seek this substance without regard to consequence, which is our definition of type 2 opiate addiction, intense seeking. To avoid that, you've just had 1 or 2 doses. Hey, here's the nature of the disease. You just got to stop taking them. And if you get sick, we're going to help you. We're going to have somebody give them to you. So you have this funny kind of disease. But you're not going to end up on the streets. All you got to do is be aware of the fact that it's floating around out there. The genes are floating around out there. 1 in 1,000, because 90% of addiction occurs in teenagers. So you got 4 people per 1,000, 3 of them are going to addict in high school, and that's 1 person running around. So when you go to the emergency room, you say, doctor, I've never had an opiate before, and therefore I have a chance of 1 in 1,000 of becoming addicted. And if I suddenly go on a magic carpet ride after this opiate you give me, I'm going to come back and talk to you. Is that okay, doctor? And we can set up a little program to deal with my side effect. Just like you would come back and deal with the side effect of an arthritis drug. Uh-oh, your bone marrow's sick, so we're going to pump all these drugs and goose up your bone marrow. Same thing. It's a medical model for type 2 opiate addiction. Different than the other types of addiction, marijuana, cocaine, amphetamine, and most alcoholics. So those are the facts. So people need to know the facts. Okay, your kid in high school has a 1% chance. That means in a high school of 1,000 kids, there are 4 of them sitting there ready to addict. Now, what's happening today because of ignorance is the kid becomes addicted and is feeling so wonderful and then drifts off and gets heroin and dies. Wouldn't it be nicer if we had film strips in the high school? Okay, everybody, this is what it's like if you go to some party and you take a Vicodin and you're off on the moon, then you've got a new disease. And it's genetic, and we need to treat it right away. It's an emergency. You could basically stop all the disasters from opiate addiction with the simple question, have you ever had an opiate? So there's my little doctor piece for the evening, Joshua. What do you think?
I hear you, Tom.
Thank you, Andrew.
All I can say is good luck trying to convince the idiots that are running this country about something that nuanced that I barely understand when they can't even see what's in front of their faces, that the more they clamp down on pills, the more people are dying. So I don't know how old you are. You seem to be familiar with the brothels in China in the 1800s, so that may or may not be a clue. But you have to live a whole lot longer than that before anybody's going to accept what you want to do with genetic testing.
Well, I guess the thing is the inconsistency. We need to answer the question: why aren't there more addicts? You know, a million addicts sounds like A million addicts sounds like a lot, but when you divide it by the population, you only get 4 people per 1,000, which is not 0. So why don't we have more? All these articles we're reading about overprescribing and blah, blah, blah. Why don't we have more addicts? And the government is counting the number of heroin addicts, not me. It's a real figure. Why don't we have more addicts? And we've got to answer that question.
Would you like to take one more call?
As soon as I finish coughing. There's my little cough button, right?
Yes.
Yes, I would like to have another call. And
okay. Maybe
we can get Josh to join in and answer it. We can have a joint but different answer to the question. Go ahead.
That is certainly possible. Well, maybe unlikely, but it's possible.
All righty then. So, caller from area code 615. What's your first name and what's your question for Dr. Kline and Dr. Josh?
My name is Carla, and I've been in touch with Jonelle quite a bit, and she encouraged me to call tonight and ask about a pain pump.
Pain pumps, it's just easier to put it in your mouth. Why have a pain pump? They cost money. They make money for people. Yeah, and I find that most people that are talked into pain pumps, the first thing they do is they cut back on their oral medicine, so they're having horrible pain. They say, hey, you want this nice pain pump? I mean, these things are like $40,000, and it costs a couple $1,000s a month to maintain them. And then if your doctor who's maintaining the pump suddenly disappears, which seems to be quite frequent in this business, now you're stuck with this pain pump inside your body and nobody to put the medicine in it. So my view of those and electrical stimulators is if all attempts to give maximum doses of opiates has failed, and that's very, very few people, then you can consider those things. But people that I talk to, they don't quite get to that point where they are FDA titrating the medicine up to a point that it either works or it causes a side effect or it doesn't work. And in my experience and in talking to other people, I'm not a pain doctor, I'm a chronic disease specialist, but in talking to pain doctors, they all say, that the vast majority of patients respond very nicely to a maximum dose, a titrated dose of opiates, or switching to another opiate. Some people, they don't agree with the opiate. So I think there's a need for pain pumps in very rare patients. Joshua, you want to join in on that or pass?
No, I have nothing to add, Tom.
Okay, that's a good move if you're playing bridge. Just pass. No. Or is that another game? Old maid. Okay. Do we have other questions?
I think we have one more call.
Okay. Tonight they're all free, so feel free to ask your questions.
We have an anonymous caller. What's your first name? Okay. And what's your question for Dr. Kline and Joshua?
Hi, this is Julie calling from New York City, and I'm enjoying the show, but I think there's an elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. I found an article written by Andrew Kolodny that he doesn't believe there are 2 different types of narcotic takers. One, pain patients, and the other addicts. And I believe that he saw an opportunity to use chronic pain patients as a meal ticket to fill his rehabs and to sell his Suboxone, because he knew there wasn't enough addicts to fill this hole. And until they stop and understand the difference between somebody who is suffering in pain, who does not crave any more than they need, and addiction, who have to increase their doses, we don't stand a chance. He's the one who lumped us all into one pool, and we can't seem to get out of that pool. I probably thought about addiction as much as an addict thought about sarcoidosis. Now I have to think about them all the time. Yet, nobody cares about what's happening to me. I've been lumped in. And that is the biggest problem right now, is that there's no rational sense of proportion and there's no separation between drug addicts and people who have incurable diseases who are never getting better and lack non-narcotic humane treatment options.
Yeah, there's 10 million people with painful disease according to NIH, and there's 1 million addicts. So you get a 10-to-1 ratio. The question is, why does everybody keep talking about Dr. Kolodny? He's entitled to his opinion, just as the man on the corner with the sandwich boards and the long beard has said, you know, Tuesday, the world is coming to an end. Well, what do? Do we run around going, uh-oh, you know, get the kids into the station wagon, the world's coming to an end on Tuesday? You know, people that have different opinions, or in the words of an ex-FDA official, lunatic fringe people, well, the guy on the corner saying the world's coming to an end is lunatic fringe. So, I mean, why do we bring it up on the air? You know, it's like I know Joshua has predicted the end of the world, and we don't listen to him, so why should we listen to Dr. Kolodny? Would you care to comment there, Dr. Bloom?
Well, part of it's the press. I mean, they're lazy and they're stupid. And if they can get a good quote and a plausible story, whether it's accurate or not, really doesn't matter much. They're going to go with it. They don't want to do a bunch of research. They got deadlines, and they're all getting fired because the press is collapsing anyhow. So it's just kind of the nature of the beast. Once you're nominated as an expert, they're going to keep going to you. And unfortunately, we got the wrong expert.
You know, something else I didn't realize about reporters is their pay really is awful. You know, so they're very competitive, and like you say, they haven't got time to research a story. You know, their editors are saying, and a lot of times stringers are paid by the story. Yeah, it's really a shame that no one has set up a point-counterpoint, which is the usual thing when you're reporting. You know, you find somebody on one side of the issue and somebody on the other side, and you present both sides. But I read an awful lot of stuff with the prop organization members that does not appear to have a counterpoint, and there is a counterpoint. So when they present things that don't have counterpoints, it's like the guy on the street corner, you know, saying the world's coming to an end, and you just ignore it. But good point, caller from Manhattan or the Bronx.
Let me just throw something in because it's kind of frightening. I'm reading a book called In the Garden of Beasts, and it's by an author. Oh God, I don't remember his name. Anyhow, it's about Nazi Germany around 1938, and it's just starting to show signs of what it will become. I mean, 1933. I'm sorry. And the author's name is Eric Larson, and he's wonderful. And there is a frightening similarity to what was done to the Jews in Berlin, and it crept in little by little, and one by one their rights got taken away. And the similarity between that and what the DEA is doing to doctors now is really troubling. And like, where's the ACLU? They're worried about who's using what bathroom, and something that's, you know, very similar to Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia is going on under our noses, and they're worrying where people take a leak. Like, wake up, guys, you know? You got a problem on your hands.
Yeah, very good point. You know, this was happening to millions of German citizens who were Jewish. And, you know, the laws started off early in the 30s, as you mentioned, with you couldn't marry a Jew, or you couldn't get a divorce, or you couldn't work in the school. It just got worse and worse. And that's what's happening. Now I'm struggling trying to find pharmacies for my patients. It just every month it moves deeper and deeper into the abyss. And the legal profession has dried up, and maybe they'll wake up when they have a lot of pain themselves or their family has pain. They're stumbling around trying to figure out what to do. Well, I'll give you an example. Medicare administration, the CMS, has passed these opioid restrictions. And the AMA just came out and said these restrictions are baloney, but the AMA keeps pressing on, and now they're going to cut off at 200 milligrams. There's no evidence anywhere that high doses cause more addictions. Remember, one pill. So high doses have nothing to do with the addiction. Nothing. But yet here is a big federal agency getting ready to screw people, if their MME is over 200. Based on a survey that I did, more than half of people require more than 200. Nobody's ever bothered to check it out. They set these numbers. So there's a good reason for an injunction, because these will harm people. Injunctions are about stopping something that will presumably harm somebody. Cutting people off their pain medicines will harm them. They will go and quit work. They will sit at home. They will kill themselves. There's plenty of evidence out there. There is a case. Half of the people that follow us on Twitter with chronic pain and painful diseases are disabled. You can't discriminate against a disabled person by saying you don't have cancer, so you can't get this drug. Real obvious stuff. But every time I hear somebody going to the ACLU, they act like they can't figure out what to do. It's the same way it was in Germany. Everybody just ran around going, what are we going to do? And of course, there wasn't very much you could do except get out of the country. And that's how we got famous people like Einstein, who saw this coming. So you're right, Josh. This is no different. This affects, we think that the number of 6 to 7 million people yanked off their medicines is a pretty good number. And even if it's not a good number, where is everybody with their little surveys finding out what's going on? Nobody has any idea how bad this is. And it's because people are hiding. They have to hide. You can't run around and say, oh, I'm a chronic pain patient and take opiates, because 2 days later your house will be broken into. A lot of folks with these awful systemic inflammatory diseases, they're too sick to get up and go to a rally. But you know what? And I'm going to put this out there for everybody. Every time there's a little rally in Raleigh, North Carolina, it gets in the newspaper. And the last one I saw had 6 people holding up their little signs. I forget what it was, protect hamsters or something. But, even the silliest little rallies get in the newspaper. So I say again, if you can do it, get out there with some signs in front of hospitals, in front of doctors' offices, and say, why aren't we being treated for our pain? Who are we? What's going on? Make up some great signs and get a permit. You get a permit from the police department to tell you where to stand and everything, but it's your right to assemble. It's in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. And you don't have to take chronic pain patients or patients with painful diseases, as we're trying to say. You can take your friends. Anybody can hold up a sign. They don't run around saying, are you a chronic pain patient with your sign? No, it's just people carrying signs. So you get healthy people to go with you. And, if you're really afraid that somebody's going to break into your home, you have to take that risk. It's awful. But when people are civilly disobedient, according to the great William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court judge, who said, you have the right to be civilly disobedient, but you have to be ready for the consequences. So figuring out ways to be safe, maybe going to another city, protest in a city that's 2 hours away. Yeah, you got to get in the car. and you don't have any pain meds because all the doctors think they're, going to turn you into a dope fiend and they're going to be arrested by the police, but something's got to change, and we need some courage out there, I mean, I expect the DEA any day, you just never know. It's like all doctors, who prescribe pain meds. It's a lot easier not to prescribe them, as most doctors have. So that's all I have to say for the evening. Josh, do you want to say something? Rant and rave, like me?
I don't have anything much to add, Tom. I don't know how long it's going to take until people wake up and see, the real tragedy that's going on here. And they may not. I mean, they didn't wake up in Nazi Germany. It took a long time for the United States to wake up from slavery, Jim Crow. It's an unpopular cause. And the only way this is going to change is when enough people get hurt and can't get anything to treat themselves with. And that could take an awful long time. Or whether some of the jackasses in Congress or the governors fall down the stairs or maybe get pushed down. But of course they'll get their drugs because they have power and they'll figure out something. So, I wish I could be more optimistic, but I'm just not.
Well, it's hard to be, so I approach it from the standpoint of information and teaching. I'm also a teacher besides being a physician. And I really think that teaching the truth helps. So that's my viewpoint. Now, I want to leave everybody with a little puzzle. Okay? The New England Journal reported many years ago, and it's reported here again, that there's an increased incidence of substance abuse amongst older people. And this is based on looking at those computers, and what they're doing is they're catching older people as doctor shoppers, getting opiates from many prescribers and going to multiple pharmacies. So what's going on? All of a sudden we have an addiction epidemic amongst older people? Okay, you can have
answer that one.
You're not going to answer it. You have to tune in next week.
Okay, well, I can answer it to myself because at least I'm listening. But yeah, it's a good question, and the answer lies in epidemiology, and I'll just leave it at that.
All right. So we'll give you a chance, and there is a little prize if you get the right answer, which is to come and wax my car.
I thought you were going to say wax your body, because like.
All right, hit the mute button there, producer.
If anybody's still listening, good luck sleeping tonight, by the way. Get that image out of your head. Yeah, I'll wax your car, Tom. No problem.
All right, that's all I have to say. Brian, is it time for us to go home?
I think
get our evening donuts.
I think it is about donut 30. So
yes, okay.
Call Nation, thanks everybody for listening in. Hope you've enjoyed this with Dr. Kline and Dr. Josh Bloom. Please join us again next week at 8 p.m. and we will be doing this again. Thanks a bunch and have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night. Everybody still there?
I'm still here.
Good, thanks.
Yeah, good having you on. The blind leading the blind is really, a thing that works. So, all right, so what's the answer?
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.